A Grain of Wheat, chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5. It took our whole school to make 2 baseball teams. Besides baseball, we played ante-over, kick the can, dare base, and Indian. In winter, we played fox and geese in the snow. George Haynes's pond was near the school. It was a good place to skate when the ice was smooth and thick enough. Our skates were the kind that clamped onto your shoes. The clamps fastened with a key, and I could never get mine tight enough. My skates kept coming off. When there was snow, we brought our sleds to school. Each sled had a name. Mine was the Flying Arrow. Wayne King, who lived across the road from me, had one named King of the Hills. Coasting down a hill was like flying. Not so much fun was the walk back up, dragging our sleds behind us. Once during every school year, the boys made what we called a hut. It was a lean-to against the side of the coal house. We made it of boards, logs, whatever we could find. Tall grass grew under the hedge trees. It dried stringy and tough. We pulled it up until we had a big stack. Then we covered the outside of the hut with it. The idea was to cover the hut until it was completely dark inside. The hut was for boys only. We told the girls they couldn't come in. I can't remember that any of them ever wanted to. In the first grade, we had spelling, numbers, reading, and writing. I was slow at numbers, better at spelling. What I really liked were reading and writing. I wanted to learn new words. I wanted to write them and put them together to see what I could make them say. I would write apple. It could be an apple or the apple. It could be on a tree or in a dish. It could be green, red, or yellow. Words were wonderful. By writing them and putting them together, I could make them say whatever I wanted them to say. It was a kind of magic. Reading was a kind of magic too. In a book, I could meet other people and know what they were doing and feeling and thinking. From a book, I could learn about life in other places, or I could learn everyday things like tying a knot or building a birdhouse. By the time I was ready for the 3rd grade, I had read most of the books in our school library. There weren't many. I wanted more. Except for my 3 Christmas books, we had no children's books at home. I began reading whatever I could find in the family bookcase. There was a thick book called Oliver Twist. It had words I didn't know, but there were many I did know, and I was able to read the story all the way through. Lee, the soldier who married my sister, went to California. Louise followed him, but for a time she was in Missouri while he was far away by the Pacific Ocean. I wrote this poem about them. California and Missouri, hand in hand over the sand, down by the sea, and there sits Lee, 'tis California. Go out and romp in the swamp and pick some peas, there sits Louise, 'tis Missouri. It was my first poem. I started to write a story, but it was never finished. I called it How Planets Were Born. This is the way it began. One night, old Mother Moon had 1,000,000 babies. Now I knew why I had said in the 1st grade that I wanted a table. Even then, I wanted to be a writer. And didn't writers sit at tables or desks when they wrote? Chapter 6. All winter the trees were bare. Winters were so long, I was afraid I might forget the leaves. How big they were, what shape, what color. One summer I picked all the different kinds of leaves I could find and pressed them in the big dictionary. When winter came, I took them out, so there was no chance of my forgetting. Leaves were important to me. Trees were important. I must have known every tree on our farm. One of my favorites was the sycamore that grew by the creek. It was the only sycamore in our woods. Its trunk was smooth, pale brown and silver. One spring day, Sam Reed came to our house. He was a neighbor on the north. "Get an axe! Get some buckets!" he shouted. And he and my father ran off into the woods. They came back with the buckets full of honey. "Where did you get it?" asked my mother. "From a bee tree," said my father. A bee tree was a tree with a hollow in it where bees had made honey. "Sam found it," my father said. "He saw bees coming out of a hole in the sycamore tree. We cut it down and—" "You cut it down?" I said. "We had to get the honey," he said. "You cut down the sycamore tree," I shouted, "just for some old honey?" I went to the woods. I told myself it wasn't true, but it was. I could hardly bear to look at the sycamore tree lying on the ground. For a while I wouldn't speak to my father, and I wouldn't eat any of the honey. I remember that well. I remember this too. I said I wished I knew how to swim. My father went to his workshop and came out with 2 boards. He had nailed them together in the shape of a T. "Come on," he said. "Now?" I asked, because the sky was growing dark and I could see it was going to rain. "Now," he said. I went with him through our woods and into the woods across the road. The creek was wider there, with pools big enough to fish or swim in. We stopped at one of them. I took off my clothes. He floated the T of wood on the water. "Lie down on it," he said. I did, and it held me up. "Paddle," he said. I paddled and kicked until I was in the middle of the pool. Then I saw that the wooden T had floated out from under me. I was swimming without it. "Keep going," said my father. I kept going, across the pool and back. I could swim. We walked home. Just as we got into the house, there was a crash of thunder, and rain began to pour. I wondered about my father. How had he known how long it would take to walk to the creek, teach me to swim, and walk back before it started to rain?